Hi, I'm Scott from the Rio Grande Tech Team, and today I'm going to show you how to transfer files from ZBrush into other CAD programs and vice versa. So let's get started. Okay, so I've got ZBrush booted up, and what we're going to be doing today is we're going to start in another CAD software. We're going to make a signet ring. We're going to bring it into ZBrush. We're going to add to it, and then we're going to bring it back into the previous CAD software. And what this is going to show you is the process of bringing things in and out of ZBrush. So regardless of whether we start in one CAD software and come into ZBrush, or we start in ZBrush and move it into the other program, this video will show you how to do both. So the first thing we need to look at is we need to look at what type of files we can actually bring into ZBrush. So over here in the tool palette, we're going to click on the import button, and it'll bring up the window. I just want to click on this drop down box and let's take a look at some of the file types that we can use. So there's a pretty good selection of them, but the ones we're going to be concerning ourselves with are the OBJ format and the STL format. OBJ is different in that it can actually bring along color information. So if you're using things like polypaint, it can actually bring that along with it. STL is just the standard format for 3D printing, but it will allow us to transfer back and forth, and we don't need to worry about color information and things like that for 3D printing. So this is the one we're going to be using today, is the STL format. Now I'm just going to cancel out of that, and I'm going to bring up the other CAD program we're going to be using today. So this is called Two Shapes for Rhino. Two Shapes is a kind of jewelry service software that encompasses elements of business management, e-commerce, but CAD is a very big part of it. And this is a plugin that they made for Rhino. Rhino is a very prolific CAD software used by a lot of different industries, and they encourage people to build things on top of it. And the developers at Two Shapes made a plugin specifically for Rhino. So it adds a lot of those jewelry builders and things like that. So we're going to be building a signet ring in here. So to get started, I'm going to navigate to my Shanks module, and I'm going to click on signet ring. I'm going to open up this window and give it a different view so we can see it a little better. Now I want to make some quick changes to this before we get started. Because I'm going to create a little recessed area. We're going to do kind of a monogram type ring. So I want to create that. And this shank is a little thick for my taste. So we're going to change that as well. The top shape looks okay. I don't think I'll need to change that. So I'm going to click into here so we can edit some of these elements. And I'm going to do a 2mm thickness on the bottom and 2mm thickness on the side. That's pretty good. And the last thing I need to do is I need to add this little recessed area, and I can just click right there. It adds it in, and we're good to go. So now I can go ahead and confirm those. And now we're ready to export this as an STL file and bring it into ZBrush. So I'm going to select it and navigate to export. And I'm going to select, as you can see, Rhino has a ton of different file formats that it works with, so it's a very versatile program. And I'm going to select STL because we need to save it as an STL file, and I'm going to call it ZBrush Signet. And now I can just kind of enter through these, and there we go. Now I've exported it as an STL file. And let's go ahead and bring it into ZBrush. On my tool palette, I'm going to click the import button up here, and I'm going to find the file that I just created. So here's my ZBrush Signet STL file, and you'll get this in here. This window it talks about skipping colors. Is do not import colors when reading STL binary file. You really just it's already going to be highlighted. You can just click OK, and it will it will bring that in. You'll have a little message right up here saying it was brought in successfully, and you can click on that message to make it go away. And now you can see I've got my signet ring here in my tool palette. So now I can, just like any other tool, I can left click and drag to bring this in and immediately hit the T key to go into edit mode. Okay, so the first thing we need to do when we bring in a file from another CAD software is we need to look at the geometry. So I'm going to turn on polyframes down here, and let's take a quick look. As you can see, in something like Rhino, it's working with very low poly. Right now, I'm about just a smidge under 7,000 active points. So I've got some pretty large triangles here, much smaller ones here, and it's pretty irregular right now. Now this wouldn't be very good for sculpting because it's going to look pretty jagged once we start sculpting on this, unless we're using something like Sculptress or something like that. So what I'm actually going to do first is I'm going to add some geometry, and I'm going to do that with Dynamesh. So I'm going to navigate to the geometry palette, and I'm going to open up Dynamesh, and I'm going to turn this up quite a bit. I think I'm going to do about 512. I'm going to turn on the polish button. It kind of helps polish everything, but it also helps keep some of these corners intact. And now I can click Dynamesh, and now I've got some geometry that I can really work with. And I'm at about 312 active points. So that's pretty good. And if I turn off my polyframe, you can see it still kept it pretty smooth. I could even bring up the resolution even more if I wanted to, but I think that's going to be good for our purposes. So the change that I'm going to make is I want to add some texture to the outside of this ring, and I'm going to do that with noise. More specifically, I'm going to add a noise maker, but first I want to mask off this top area right here because I don't want the texture to be inside here, I just want it to be on the outside. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to hold Control to go into my masking brush up here. And one thing I want to show you real quick is that if I hold my mask and I mask on the inside here, you can see it's actually masking the backside as well. Now we don't want that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold Control, I'm going to keep it held down, and I'm going to turn on a feature inside my brush menu here. So I'm going to click on the brush menu, I'm going to find Auto Masking, open that, and I'm going to click on Backface Mask. So I'm going to undo that, and now when I do my mask in that same spot, I'm not getting any of that mask on the backside. You'll see that even with sculpting brushes, it may have an effect on the outside when you're sculpting on the inside. It's mainly with thinner meshes. So that is a very useful trick to keep that from happening in the future. So now I'm just going to hold Control, and I want to try to get this mask right on that edge. And it doesn't matter if I go over a bit. I'm going to clean it up here in just a sec. So got a little bit that went over the edge here. So if I do Control and Alt, it will undo that mask, and I'm just going to clean it up ever so slightly. And if this was going to be a finished piece for a customer, I really would take the time to be as precise as possible. For demonstration purposes, I'm not going to be too precise. So I'll clean up that area, and I'm going to bring my draw size down so I can make sure I've got a nice clean edge there. So touch it up just a bit right over here. And I need to get this inside area as well. So holding Control and just getting that inside rim. Wherever I don't have my mask is where this texture is going to be applied. So that looks pretty good. Again, if I was doing this for a customer, I might kind of clean up some of these edges a bit. But for right now, that looks pretty good. I could also do this for the inside of the ring shank as well. So that is completely your choice on whether you want something like a texture on the inside. But I'm just going to leave it unmasked for now. So we are ready to do our surface noise. Under the surface palette, I'm going to go ahead and expand it. And I'm going to click on one of the pre-made noisemakers in the lightbox. So it brings up all of these pre-made textures. And I'm going to pick, let's do this one right here. So noise 48. I'm going to double click on that. And then I'm going to close my lightbox. Now, this isn't added to my mesh just yet. This is a representation. And we can actually go in and make a few edits. So over here in our surface palette, I can click on Edit. It will bring up this separate window, and inside I can control the same way I do in my scene here. And I can use some of these options over here to make some different adjustments. So I'm going to grab my plugin scale and give it a bit more, maybe a bit too much. Something like that. That's a little better. And when you're doing stuff like this, you can just play with some of the sliders and see what kind of results you get. And to get a more accurate view on this window, go ahead and click OK, and then click Apply to Mesh. And then you can really see what that noise is going to look like. And you can see it's a bit jagged here, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to control drag off to the side, and that'll clear my mask. And then I'll do it again to re-Dynamesh. So that's pretty good. Smooth everything out, and keep in mind that with a piece of jewelry, you're going to be seeing it something like that. So when you're really zoomed in far, you may see a bit of a rough surface in there, but you could always bring up the resolution and make that much smoother if you want. Okay, so now we're ready to pull this out of ZBrush and bring it back into our previous CAD program. The first thing we want to do before we do that is we want to look at our active points. So with certain programs like Rhino, for instance, they will have limits on what they can take in terms of the geometry in your model. So when you get up into 500,000 to maybe 1,000,000 polys or even more, you bring those into another program and they can severely bog it down to the point where you're effectively watching a slideshow rather than manipulating your model. So right now we're at about 347,000 points, which actually would probably transfer into Rhino pretty easily. But I want to show you, if you're working with a really high poly model, I want to show you how to decimate it to make it easier on the other program when you bring it in. So the way we're going to do this is we're going to use the Decimation Master. That can be found in the Z plugin menu, and open up Decimation Master. And what it's going to do is it's going to look at the geometry of this model, and it's going to determine what areas can be high poly and what areas can be low poly. So when you get into surfaces like up here on this flatter part, or even on the raised sections, those don't need to be higher poly. But around these corners and these little areas that are sunken in, those do. We want to retain that definition there. So that's what Decimation Master is going to do for us. So the first thing we need to do is we need to pre-process it. So it's actually going to look at the model and determine where those areas are going to be. So you can either pre-process current, which will process your the subtool that you have selected, or you can do all, and it will pre-process every subtool that you have in your scene. Since we only have this one subtool, I'm just going to hit pre-process current, and you'll see a progress bar up here at the top. And there we go. Just a few seconds to pre-process it. And now I go back into the Decimation Master, and I can do decimate current. Now you can actually select the percentage of decimation. It's 20% by default. That's more than adequate for our situation. If you change this value, you would need to pre-process it, but since we're not going to be changing it, I can just hit decimate current to go ahead and decimate this model. So I'll click that, and that's it. You can see it hasn't really changed much, but now we're down to about 69,000 polys. If I turn on polyframe, you can see how it kind of behaves like Sculptress. It has areas of low poly, and then it's using the high poly areas in these little fissures here. And same for the flat areas. Those are much bigger triangles, and that way we can really lower the poly count without affecting the detail too much. Now I can run this over and over again and really, no pun intended, but decimate my model to the point where it's completely decimated. But yeah, this is more than adequate. I have brought 500,000 poly models into Rhino, and it worked just fine. So I would encourage you, if you are using another CAD program and you're starting to work with ZBrush, see how far you can push it. It depends on a number of factors. The CAD program you're using, the computer that you have. So yeah, feel free to push it as far as you can. So now let's go ahead and pull this out. So we've got it decimated, and I'm going to use the 3D Print Hub in our Z plugin menu. So the first thing I need to do is I need to update my size ratios. So I'm going to click on that. And the nice part about STL files is that it carries with it unit information. So it has these units here, 18.39 by 8.12 by 20.35, kind of embedded in the file, so that when you bring it into like a 3D printing software, for instance, it knows what size it needs to be. With ZBrush, it's not sure whether those values apply to inches or to millimeters. So it just depends on what you made the model in. I primarily work in millimeters, so that's the one that I'm going to select. And now that I've updated my size ratios, I can go back to the Z plugin menu, back to my 3D Print Hub, and all those values have been populated in here, and I can click Export to STL. So now I'm going to give it a name, and I'm going to add on textured and hit enter. And now we get the message saying it was successfully exported. I can click on that to clear it, and now we can go back into our other CAD program. So we're back in 2Shapes for Rhino, and I'm just going to delete this model because we don't need it anymore. And I'm going to import the file that we just made. So here's our ZBrush Signet textured. And with Rhino, it's always asking those units that we assigned in ZBrush, it's reading those units and it wants to know what those are. Are those millimeters? Are those inches? And we assigned them to millimeters, so I can keep that box the same and click OK. So here we go. So I'm actually going to move this to the center of my screen here. And give a bit more of a shaded view. And here we go. So there is my model. And you can see it's moving freely. It's not taxing on the computer at all. By decimating it, we've retained the detail, but I can still bring it in to Rhino and continue working on it and use all of these jewelry tools that are part of the Two Shapes for Rhino plugin. So the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a bit of a monogram on there. So I'm going to go into the solid module here and do the text command. And we're just going to do the letter Z. And I've got some adjustments here as far as the thickness and things like that that I can play with. So I'm going to click OK. And I'm going to go, meant to click on that, but doesn't matter. So I'm going to move this back to the center here. And use my handles here to kind of rough it out in the center just a little bit. And now use this one to bring it up into that recessed area, right so it's right along the top of that edge. So I need to make a few adjustments. Yeah, it's not completely centered. So go ahead and adjust it like that. There we go. So that's it. This could be a finished piece. I could actually add some stones to it if I wanted to do like maybe some pave or something along these. You know, the options are limitless. But I can now export this as an STL. I can bring it back into ZBrush if I want, add some more stuff there, bring it back into Two Shapes. So that's how you're able to do that in an efficient way. By decimating before you bring it into Rhino, you're going to be able to keep working in Rhino effectively, so it's not a slideshow when you try to turn the screen like this. And you can transfer them back and forth as many times as you want. Just keep an eye on the geometry as you're transferring back and forth so you're not losing detail. But that's it. That's how you transfer things back and forth. And yeah, if you have any questions, always feel free to contact us.